Molweni, Dumelang, Sambonani, and welcome to the AVRIC podcast, a podcast that aims to bring clarity to the concept of violence and its consequences in the lives of victims and survivor groups, as well as the perpetrators and their descendants. In this episode, Professor Siona O'Connell talks about her short film, Ballie Boys.
This is the wonderful Siona O'Connell, a documentary filmmaker, an academic, works at the University of Pretoria, lives in Cape Town, and she's going to do her presentation in two parts today. She's going to talk for about half an hour, then she's going to show us a film. So over to you, Siona.
Thank you very much. I'm very much a part of this film. My dad was a student and teacher at this school that I've made a film about, and he died last year as a result of COVID. And I'm hoping that this is a film that's it's a story about hope. What are the ways to think about freedom and justice when political freedom without equality falls far short of the promise that was made to South Africa in 1994? My body of work looks at apartheid injuries, particularly those that fall beyond the TRC Commission, seeking to understand the heavy price that continues to be exacted by our past, especially as a result of race-based forced removals. It is no surprise then that I'm invested in understanding how power and domination operate, all the while seeking my own freedom, along with that of others, all of us implicated in a catastrophic mess. How do we forge fully human identities? What are our duties and responsibilities? And how do we constantly imagine and create the free human? My work sits squarely in my childhood, the unshakable memory of the forced removal of my family from District 6 and being raised in a family of educators. These two threads situate my work as an African studies scholar, committed to surfacing the complexities of freedom that are weaved into the archive of the ordinary, a term coined by my friend and mentor, Professor Anthony Bogues of Brown University. This archive is constituted by the unnamed human, those in the shadows, on the periphery, the discarded, and the vulnerable. My work is a mirror to our society, offering a particular lens to promote reflexivity, justice, and accountability. It points to unwritten histories and persistence of forms, modes, and sites of inequality that make freedom illusory. Place and opportunity are central in my work, so it is no coincidence that much of it pivots on the topics of land and education. Both themes have shaped my personal life in profound ways, and for the uninitiated, also turn out to be central sites of opportunity or lack thereof in the broader developmental discourses. My work has been underpinned by the entanglements of colonialism, slavery, and apartheid, the cornerstones that continue to uphold inequalities in South Africa. As my work has shifted across the years, I realized too, though, that listening to and recording narratives of oppressed lives is not enough. Documenting suffering cannot by itself offer redemption, but exposing injustices and the complex ways in which suffering begets suffering, I believe, is a necessary starting point in the ongoing fight for freedom from inequality. If my presentation, a short one, results in only one takeaway, it is this point. According to the Gini Index, the most widely used measure of inequality, South Africa is the most unequal society in the world. This pattern has remained more or less unchanged in the quarter century of political freedoms that we have enjoyed. More than a quarter of a century after the end of apartheid, the richest 10% are still predominantly from the white minority group, while the poorest 40% is the exclusive reserve of the black majority. A society cannot maintain this level of unequal opportunity and claim to be free. A fair distribution of income is both a moral imperative and crucial to a socially cohesive society. My work, and this film in some ways, is about the causes, the histories, and consequences of this level of entrenched inequality and unequal opportunity. It seeks to expose the daily indignities of economic oppression that sits faceless behind a mere number. It seeks to document how we got here and the price that far too many paid and continue to pay. But above all, I'm only a storyteller. For today's talk, I will take you to a little-known school on the Cape Flats in Athlone called St. Columba's High School, and draw on lessons in the classroom to think about another part of our history, students who joined the armed struggle against apartheid. I think this is my one film, more than any of the others, that is about hope. The question has been asked by Professor Robert van Niekerk, formerly of Rhodes and at Wits. If St. Columba's pupils were supposedly by first inclination not political, and that this was also somehow contrary to the ethos of being a Ballie Boy, which is what St. Columba's boys were called, boys of the old men, how is it then explained that the smallest school in the Athlone region produced as many as 3 students in different generations who made a decision of conscience and enlisted in Umkhonto we Sizwe, MK, the armed wing of the African National Congress? There are many factors that come to bear in influencing the level of political consciousness of young people, of which in some instances the high school years are of great significance. Some of this is linked to the time of life, early to mid-adolescence, during which period many questions are posed about the world, about its norms and expectations, among other things. Asking these questions and discussing them with peers and teachers might lead to answers which might be political in nature. Another factor could be the extent to which that particular school is regarded as a site of struggle by teachers at that school. As intimated in the above question, there were certain schools in the Cape, certainly, regarded as being political, but St. Columba's was not known to be one of these. Cape Town schools such as Harold Cressy, named after the co-founder of the Teachers League of South Africa, had a clearly political function. Trafalgar High, a number of political icons attended the school. Livingston High School, largely associated with the Unity Movement, and Fazika and Ida Mkhize High Schools, hubs of Cape protests in solidarity with the June 1976 uprisings in Soweto, were among those best known for their political activism and leadership. They were particularly known for having had progressive teachers who would engage students with alternative reading material. Even though St. Columba's could not claim to be one of the Cape's political schools, it did not stand aloof from the political climate, temporally and geographically, in which it existed. The school's ethos, based on its founding ideology, was largely conservative in terms of its methodologies and governments and discipline. While it would be incorrect to label St. Columba's as being completely apolitical, there are no records or accounts to suggest that it came anywhere close to being a school characterized by the leadership roles played by staff and students in any direct political activity in the region. The film will show students talking about the support roles that they played, particularly during the 1980s, but none claim to have been initiators or leaders of the protests. Having said that, there are also a number of other factors outside of the school that would have impacted on the politicization of youth, including the areas of residence, which would have been determined by the socio-economic class of their families, as well as the types of jobs and work experiences of parents and guardians. The experience of township living and the awareness of inequalities and oppression under apartheid served as a daily political education for many young people. Appalling living conditions, unequal education, and the harassment of their parents for past offences are other examples of being exposed to inequalities. Young people whose mothers were domestic workers or child minders for white bosses might have had occasion to visit them in their elaborate homes where they worked, or they would have been further reinforced their awareness of inequalities. In addition, and importantly, the experience of group areas forced removals would have been within the living memory of a 1980s youth, or they might have grown up with their parents expressing longing for their lost homes, the post-memory experiences that Marion Hirsch talks about, as well as living with the lingering pathologies resulting from them being displaced. The experiences of playing sport, whether at school or club level, would have exposed them to the inequalities inherent in the apartheid sport scene. The consistent work of the South African Council on Sport, SACOS, formed in the 1970s, raised awareness of this through their slogan, "No normal sport in an abnormal society." Particularly in the late 70s and the 80s, most young people would know of family members and members of their communities would have been imprisoned or banned or were under house arrest. They would also be aware of the provision of safe houses in their families and communities which would be provided to young people who were evading arrest and detention. In this way, they would have become aware of the consequences of protest and for making your political voice heard. The early 1980s, particularly in the process leading up to the launch of the United Democratic Front in 1984, was a time of prolific organizational growth in mass mobilization. Most black communities across the country would have been exposed to consumer boycotts, factory strikes, work and school stayaways, protest marches, and service delivery protests. Particularly in the 80s, and to some extent in the 1970s, underground study groups worked through and discussed banned literature and engaged in discussions about the struggle and the strategies and tactics that could be employed in order to bring an end to apartheid. These study groups also looked at examples of other freedom struggles on the continent and beyond. They celebrated the 1974 liberation of Mozambique and Angola. They learned from the Latin and Central American grassroots struggles in Nicaragua, Chile, and Argentina. They discussed whether joining the armed struggle or going into exile was an option or not, and what the ideal connection between the external and internal struggle was. Local struggles were constantly being linked to the broader political context, and this gave impetus to the wider anti-apartheid struggle. These are some of the networks of factors that, together with the school experience, would have had an impact to varying degrees on young people of this generation. The formation of Umkhonto we Sizwe. The South African Act of Union passed in 1910 denied political rights to the black population, and the economy was white-owned. In response, the South African Native National Congress was formed on 8th of January 1912. In 1944, I think it's worth remembering, the ANC Youth League was formed by Anton Lebedi, Nelson Mandela, O.R. Tambo, and Walter Sisulu. They issued a program of action which called for stronger past action as opposed to acts of passive resistance. In 1960, the ANC and the Pan-Africanist Congress were banned. There have been several protests in the intervening years: industrial actions, resistance to forced removals, the Defiance campaign of the 1950s, the Congress of the People in 1955, the Women's March to the Union Buildings in 1956, and the Treason Trial among others. On the 16th of December 1961, Umkhonto we Sizwe, the armed wing of the ANC, was formed together with the South African Communist Party. Its purpose was to complement the strategy of mass mobilization and not replace it. The number of black students attending secondary schools increased dramatically in the late 1960s and going into the 70s. Fewer were going into the exploitative labor market. This has been partially attributed to the formation of the South African Students Association, SASO, in 1969, but there are likely other reasons for this. In the 70s, SASO developed a number of school and community consciousness-raising programs that were impactful and which contributed to the growth of confident black leadership. As we heard yesterday, June the 16th marks the day which sparked a new wave of protests led by South African youth. These specific protests were triggered by the introduction of Afrikaans as a medium of instruction to black schools, but of course, this was just the last straw in the collective frustrations growing amongst the oppressed in South Africa. This had paved the way for the decree. The way that had been paved for this decree by the passing was the passing of the Afrikaans Medium Decree issued in 1974, and to which there had been peaceful protests by students. This decree made it mandatory for black students to use the Afrikaans language as a medium of instruction in mathematics, social sciences, and geography at the secondary school level. The levels of violence that was meted out to the Soweto school students, where the protest started, led to solidarity protests throughout the country and a worldwide outcry in response to the heavy-handed police and military action. As student militancy grew, so did state repression, and a large number of youth fled the country to join MK. Known as the June the 16th Detachment, they were described as an army of youth whose anger and courage knew no bounds. They were followed by detachment after detachment, swelling the ranks of MK. Thus, from 76 onwards, the growing leadership of youth provided a rich pool for MK to draw on. This new cohort of young leaders were lauded for being assertive, militant, and courageous, and the ways in which they fought back to defend themselves. They hurled tear gas banisters back at police, came prepared with water-soaked cloths and masks to alleviate the burn of the tear gas. They used dustbin lids as shield and burnt burning barricades. Beginning late in 76, the general training of MK soldiers lasted for 6 months, with specialization courses lasting for another 3 to 4 months. Instruction was generally in English, but allowance was made for instruction in any other language, especially the vernacular, due to the varied educational levels of the cadres, as many of them arrived with having interrupted their schooling. Literacy classes were conducted on a daily basis after the formal training had been completed. Founded as a guerrilla force, MK training was unconventional. The entrance requirement simply was to be against apartheid and to have the courage to take up arms. There were no educational or any other prerequisites. It was a volunteer army, and the only grounds for exclusion were on the basis of health or age. It was simply not feasible to challenge the SADF conventionally because of its numerical and technological strength. What counted in MK's favor was that, whilst not necessarily having the numbers and advanced military technology of the SADF, its members had the political will to fight apartheid and were supported by large numbers of the oppressed. This was not always the case, particularly in the early days of its existence. The 1980s, the second wave of recruits of MK, was a period that 3 Ballie Boys joined up, and these was Eustace Hilton, Bolly Nyaranda, and Robbie Waterwich, who attended St. Columbus and who joined MK. Robbie's violent death, along with Colleen Williams, is highlighted in the film. The second wave, major wave of recruits joined in the mid-1980s, fueled by nationwide mass protests. During this time, MK experienced phenomenal growth. Some of the young recruits were sent to further their studies, whilst others worked for various structures of the ANC. The mass protests mentioned earlier were triggered by the rent and services boycotts in the Vaal Triangle, the formation of the UDF in the previous year, as well as the gradual mobilization of all sectors of society in the build-up towards its launch, laid fertile growth for the rapid growth of the broad mass democratic movement. The People's War called for the isolation of members of the security forces, especially those resident within black communities, and officials serving in local authorities, or any persons perceived to be working for the government or system, as it was called. The youth who joined MK during this period had been well initiated into the struggles of mass democratic organizations. This resulted in a higher level of political consciousness than among their predecessors in 1976 and immediately thereafter. The ANC had to expand and secure facilities, and at this stage the emphasis was on sabotage and included, and some of you may remember, the June 1980 Sasol oil refinery sabotage, the rocket attack on Fort Tekohoogte in August 1981, the Koeberg nuclear power plant attack in 1982, and the 20th of May 1983 car bomb explosion outside the South African Air Force headquarters in Church Street, Pretoria. In following its insurrectionary strategy, the focus of all training as well as mobilization shifted. Within South Africa, mass resistance had been dampened by the harsh provisions of the national state of emergency imposed on June 12, 1986. This led to the detention of thousands of activists, including students. It did not, however, put a halt to armed operations, which continued late into 1989, so that when the ANC and MK were unbanned in February 1990, many were caught unprepared for a new situation. Various attempts were made to influence events on the ground in South Africa from a side, to make the presence of MK and the ANC known and felt. The armed propaganda phase was intended primarily to make MK more visible and root it among the people. It bore fruit as its numbers multiplied within the country. There are a number of reasons why young people and students who choose to go into exile and leave their families and join MK. Some arrived at the decision on their own, based on their own personal circumstances, while others were actively recruited by cadres operating underground inside the borders of the country. What is alarming to me as a scholar is how little of this is written down in history, and how almost impossible it is to find them, especially those who have died and whose lives sit outside of the histories that we talk about in classes and lecture theatres. But I think looking at schools and students is an important way to understanding the long legacies of these histories, because a lot of these men and women are now in their 50s, lost in a history that was of their making, and now in a present that is not. And I think it's fortuitous for me it's important for me to go back to Neville Alexander, who talks about schooling in industrial societies as being an Achilles heel of the state, as it needed teachers to be loyal and indifferent to the state. The education of youth, according to the officially established state curriculum, was needed in order to reproduce the existing order, which included compliant citizens. Progressive teachers understood that. They embarked on learning journeys of critical education in their own classrooms. They started questioning the colonialist assumption that they had a monopoly on the truth, and encouraged students to question and examine the facts that they were being taught. Teachers at St. Columbus, including my dad, came late to this approach to education, but after 1976, the school, like most schools in the country, was never the same again. I was struck when I made Ballie Boys, as I said, just 3 months after my dad died. On the one hand, there was a wonderful camaraderie and loyalty to the school. We'll see it in the film. A shared understanding that being a Ballie Boy meant that they were special. However, the inevitable nostalgia is counterbalanced by notes of loss, regret, and misplaced guilt, made evident in comments about sporting talents going to waste, the weight of politicizing younger students, and of course the loss of lives in the most violent way as a result of the armed struggle against apartheid. That these were teenage boys should not be underestimated. This fact alone underscores the silences and multiple costs borne by young people in South Africa's struggle for freedom. It is cost, I believe, that has yet to be repaid. Thank you, Sophie.
Thank you for listening to this podcast. For more, you can check out our website.